I'm going to call the Springfield City Council work session to order with a roll call.
Mayor.
Here.
Counselor Weber. Here. Counselor Moe.
Here.
Counselor Rodley. Here. Counselor Blackwell. Here. Counselor Doyle. Here. And Counselor Stout.
Here, thank you. All right, we have one work session item tonight, which is the climate friendly areas update.
Yeah, I know it's been a little while. So I'm Chelsea Hartman, Senior Planner. And tonight I also have with me Monica Sather. She's our Community Engagement Lead for the project. And then Victor Tran with Cascadia Partners on Zoom tonight. So the last time we were at council with you all was with Cascadia to present the market study findings on climate friendly areas back in June of last year. So tonight, if Allison, you could please bring up the presentation. We're really going to start with a brief overview of climate friendly areas since it's been a little while, talk about the latest community engagement that we've done, and then go into staff recommendations for CFA locations. Tonight, we are seeking your selection of preferred CFA locations so that we can proceed with drafting the plan and code amendments and bring that back for the adoption process later this year. Let's see if the clicker will work. Try again. Nope. Okay, thank you. Okay. Yeah, if you can click to the next slide while I do. Thank you. So Oregon's climate friendly and equitable communities rules, which I'll try to avoid saying a lot because it's a mouthful, require some cities, including Springfield, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by identifying and adopting one or more CFAs, which will allow for dense urban mixed-use centers where people have options to meet most of their needs without only relying on a car. Some of the specific requirements include we must have at least one primary CFA that's at least 25 acres. We must accommodate at least 30% of our 20-year current and future housing need. These areas will allow for a mix of uses and be accessible by bike, walking, and transit, and include strategies to help residents keep or find housing if costs increase as CFAs redevelop. Let's see if it'll work this time. No. Okay, next slide, please. So a little bit about primary versus secondary CFAs. The state rules require that we have one primary, and we have flexibility in designating additional primary or secondary CFAs to meet our housing capacity requirement. The primary CFAs have taller building heights of about 7 stories and a higher required minimum density of 25 units per net acre. And the secondary CFAs are similar, but have lower allowed heights of about 4 stories and a lower density of 15 units per acre. Next slide, please. So in spring 2024, engagement really focused on building awareness of the project and getting early thoughts on the key features of CFAs and the potential locations. Following that, we summarized community input and the information on infrastructure availability, major landowner willingness, and market economics to discuss the potential benefits and trade-offs with Planning Commission and you all in June of last year. At that time, there was some interest in allowing more housing near jobs and supporting homeownership opportunities. Council guidance was to continue exploring all 4 of the locations, and one scenario of interest was to consider the potential for Glenwood Riverfront as a primary CFA and to consider shrinking downtown or not including Mohawk or the Gateway River Bend area. We used that as the basis for the next round of outreach in the fall, which focused on design outcomes, housing tools that could help residents keep or find housing if costs increase as these areas redevelop over time, and more specific questions about the locations being primary, secondary, or exploring smaller boundaries in some of the areas. Next slide, please. So in the fall, we used a variety of strategies to reach the people who live, work, or own property in these areas and the areas around the CFAs, along with anyone else who had an interest in the project. The combination of the strategies intended to make it more convenient and easier for people with varying levels of capacity, ability, and means to participate in order to reach more community members. Some of the key strategies in the fall were similar things from the first round, so surveys again, postcards, and this time around we had online and in-person events and did some partner agency coordination. Most of our feedback was collected in the survey, and we did receive some at in-person events on some posters. Next slide, please. So beyond regulating things like height, density, and uses, having design standards for CFAs is not required. CFAs will allow higher densities and taller heights in some cases, so we wanted to hear perspectives on what design outcomes are important to the community. The survey participants expressed a desire to balance flexible development with the ability to ensure quality outcomes. Some of the more desired design standards included things like weather protection, open spaces with amenities, and prominent entrances. And some other common ones were active ground floor uses, maximum building lengths, and building articulation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a summary of the tool categories that were provided in the community survey. We identified a list of possible tools to increase housing production and alleviate pressures from possible displacement. In general, these tools were found to be they could be applied to any of the CFA locations, and some of them could even be applied citywide as part of the city's upcoming housing planning efforts. So I'll be back in front of you all in a month from today to provide more information on the housing tools more specifically as part of an overall city housing strategy update. And at that work session on March 10th, we'll seek feedback on specific housing strategies that council may have interest in exploring further. Next slide, please. So from the survey, some key results. 41% of participants ranked tenant support, so things like renter protections, as the highest priority category. Overall, there was a strong desire for new affordable housing and helping residents find ways to stay living in the community that they're in now. 32% of survey participants ranked financial tools as another high priority, so things like direct subsidy and tax incentives. And there was a general acknowledgement that reducing the cost of development could help result in more housing units at different price points. There was general support for other tools such as public-private partnerships and streamlining development. So part of the fall survey, again, similar to the spring one, we asked about the locations. More specifically, in the fall, we asked about whether downtown or the Glenwood Riverfront should become primary CFAs, and if either of those should have smaller boundaries. And we also asked about whether Mohawk or Gateway Riverbend should become secondary CFAs. So 57% of the participants liked Glenwood Riverfront for a primary CFA with the current boundaries, and few people thought that we should shrink it to only focus on the master plan area. For downtown, 50% of participants thought it was suitable for a primary CFA with its current boundaries. And then for Mohawk, 61% of participants thought it could become a secondary CFA, and 54% for Gateway Riverbend as a secondary CFA. This slide also shows some of the poster votes that we gathered at the in-person events. So this slide might be a little bit familiar from June. We have revised it since. This shows how the different areas align with certain evaluation criteria based on the CFA study findings from 2023 and further analysis with Cascadia Partners in 2024. This just gives a quick visual way to see how suitable some of these areas are for becoming CFAs. And if you remember from our last conversation, there's challenges with each of the areas, so we tried to take that into consideration with the recommendations. So based on the community feedback and the benefits and trade-offs of each area, staff is recommending Glenwood Riverfront and Mohawk to become primary CFAs, and a smaller portion of the downtown to become a secondary CFA. Staff is not recommending Gateway Riverbend as a CFA, given its lower suitability based on the criteria, and I'll go into more detail on each of the areas and the recommendations for each in the next few slides. The CFAC rules require that one or more CFAs be large enough to accommodate 30% of our housing capacity, which equates to a little less than 10,000 housing units based on our current adopted housing needs analysis. By December 2027, we must complete a new housing analysis using projections provided by the state, which will require us to plan for more housing than when our last housing analysis was done. To proactively plan for that, staff is recommending a combination of CFAs that can accommodate a little more than 30% of our housing capacity when accounting for this new housing projection from the state. So that's kind of shown in the green text on the slide here.
Excuse me, I'm going to ask a clarifying question here. So in the situation where our housing analysis has to be redone, coming up, and I forget what year you said, would the rules support us having to revisit the CFAs if we don't have enough capacity in our CFAs?
That is one way that we could accommodate housing capacity, and that's kind of our hope of wanting to preempt that, of planning for more CFAs now so that we don't have to consider that again in a couple years.
Is our current understanding or reading of the rules require that when we get the updated housing analysis that we would have to make sure that we account for the updated projection in our CFAs?
Don't think so. I don't think we'd have to revisit CFA adoption because of that. I think as long as we're accommodating our housing capacity in a variety of different ways, so it could be other code changes, urban growth boundary expansions, those things. So I think they're definitely placing a lot of emphasis on accommodating it in a variety of ways.
Okay, so
but not just CFAs.
Okay, so while the recommendation from staff is to leave a little bit like more headroom or growth in the CFAs, that is not something that we're required to do under our okay.
Yeah, based on the CFEC rules, we only have to go off of our current adopted housing analysis. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Good question, because I know it gets confusing with all the numbers and all the moving rules. So downtown, staff recommend downtown for a secondary CFA with a revised boundary. Community input expressed general support for the larger downtown boundary that currently goes to 23rd Street to coincide with the urban renewal district. However, staff considered council comments about shrinking downtown as well as how the CFA standards could impact the adjacent residential areas. The proposed downtown CFA has an eastern boundary at 14th Street as shown on the slide, since that's a connector to the Mohawk CFA. This revision balances having less impact to the residential areas adjacent to the community commercial districts, so the large bright red area on the slide here, with having a CFA that's large enough to accommodate more housing capacity. The community commercial district currently has a transition standard where the building height must be no greater than that permitted in abutting residential districts for a distance of 50 feet. That height transition would not be allowed in CFAs and resulted in staff recommending removing a large portion of the community commercial area from the CFA. There is an alternative option for downtown where council could consider further shrinking the CFA to 8th Street, which would align with the eastern edge of the mixed-use commercial district and the nodal development area. This smaller option works if both Glenwood Riverfront and Mohawk become primary CFAs. While the community feedback was supportive of downtown for a primary, staff is recommending this for secondary since the minimum density required for primary could limit new housing development downtown since it's quite high. This also addresses concerns that the higher allowed heights for primary CFAs would not be consistent with historic properties in downtown or the adjacent Washburn Historic District and other residential areas. The code approach for downtown would include rezoning the R2 and R3 areas to mixed-use residential and applying a CFA overlay to bring the existing districts into compliance while removing the nodal development overlay since it's functioning essentially the same as a CFA would. So Glenwood is our next one. Glenwood Riverfront, we're recommending for a primary CFA, again with a revised boundary. Community feedback was supportive of the larger Glenwood Riverfront rather than only focusing on just the master plan area. the Glenwood Riverfront refinement plan that's in place implemented a 3-story height limit within the Willamette Greenway area. So we recommended amending the boundary to exclude that in order to retain the height limit next to the river. The Glenwood Riverfront ranked highly for a primary CFA and community feedback and is currently most compliant with primary CFA standards. And for the code approach for Glenwood, this would include rezoning the area to Glenwood residential mixed use and aligning that with primary CFA standards. So the main change would really to be allowing commercial uses as primary uses, which is consistent with what the master plan approach is doing for the code in that area. This approach would eliminate the Glenwood office mixed-use district and designation, and the CFA would then allow a more flexible mix of uses that can respond to different market demands. And similarly, we would remove the nodal development overlay here. We have been coordinating closely with the Glenwood master plan efforts and will continue to do so as we start drafting the plan and code amendments for the adoption process. For Mohawk, we are also recommending this one for a primary CFA, but there are no boundary changes for this area. The community feedback expressed support for Mohawk to be a secondary CFA. However, staff is recommending Mohawk for primary as it already mostly complies with the primary CFA requirements. It currently allows a mix of uses and has higher allowed heights in the mixed-use commercial district. The main change here would be to increase the required minimum density for the few mixed-use residential properties and establishing a minimum density for the mixed-use commercial district. As an alternative option for Mohawk, council could choose to make Mohawk a secondary CFA to have the lower density of 15 units per net acre while keeping the higher allowed heights that currently exist in this area. This change with the alternative option would impact the overall housing capacity of CFAs and mean that the downtown CFA boundary should remain at 14th and not shrink to 8th. The code approach here is a little simpler with just replacing the nodal development overlay with a CFA overlay to bring the existing districts into compliance. And then the last area, Gateway Riverbend. So due to infrastructure, market, and development constraints in this area, there's limited potential for new housing, and it will primarily be used for the hospital's needs. Given that and the lower existing development regulation compliance, staff is not recommending this area become a CFA. This map does show a revised boundary to exclude the floodway since that area is considered undevelopable based on the CFA requirements and should not have been included. An alternative option for this area, the community feedback did express some support for this area to become a secondary CFA. And if council prefers to designate Gateway Riverbend as a CFA, that would require an amendment to Willamette Lane's comprehensive plan that was recently updated, since that does not currently have plans for more parks access in this area. And then to summarize, so based on your direction tonight, we'll begin working on the plan and code amendments. If the staff recommendation moves forward, we would have to make changes to the Glenwood and downtown refinement plans. If council chooses to also designate the Gateway Riverbend area, we would also have to amend the Gateway refinement plan. And there will be more opportunities for the community to weigh in when we start drafting the amendments this summer and as part of the adoption process that will begin later this year. And ultimately, council will formally designate CFAs and adopt the corresponding amendments. If the Glenwood Riverfront CFA moves forward, the Lane County Planning Commission and Board of Commissioners will also be a part of the adoption process. And then my last slide here really just summarizes the last several slides of the recommendations for each area. We did share this with Planning Commission last week at their February 4th work session to get their feedback, and they did express general support for the staff recommendations. Planning commissioners agreed that Glenwood and downtown make sense and discussed reasoning for recommending Glenwood as primary and downtown as secondary. There were some comments of support for the downtown boundary at 14th Street to have a connection to Mohawk and not going smaller than that to consider our future housing planning efforts that will be beginning soon. There were also some comments appreciating the approach with considering how to implement these prescriptive state rules in a way that makes sense for Springfield, and that the recommendations considered alignment with what the city has already been working on for these areas, such as wanting active mixed use in Glenwood Riverfront and downtown, and improving how it feels to get around in Mohawk by providing more transportation options. And lastly, there were supportive comments about not including Gateway Riverbend as a CFA since it's not near or well connected with the other areas we're looking at, and comments that it's important to consider creating connections between these areas and better accessibility within them. So that is all I have, and I'll turn it back to you all. Thank you.
Any questions? Councilman Brown?
You mentioned something about County Planning Commission being involved in Glenwood. Is that because it's not in the city limits yet?
Yes, that's
It's going to
correct.
be.
Yeah, so the area we're looking at, some of it will still be outside
Okay.
the city limits, so they would
Thank you.
have to be involved.
Councilor Blackwell?
Thank you. That's a lot of information. Will the designation of a primary CFA reduce the land available for other types of needed development, needed housing? Specifically with the density requirement that's on there, the 25 per acre.
It's a good question, and that was a main reason we ended up going with the secondary recommendation for downtown because it could limit some housing types. Thankfully, the Glenwood Riverfront already has a really high density, and so there's not really much changing there. And then Mohawk, it just didn't seem as limiting, but yeah, so it definitely is more about multifamily housing would be
Right, when
here.
any single family housing,
Yeah.
duplexes, cottage cluster
Mhm.
style in those areas. So would that be, when I was reading through it, I was just thinking, are we limiting possibilities of home ownership in those areas?
It's a good question. And I don't know if Victor has any thoughts based on the market study analysis, but I mean, it's possible. I think we keep hearing it's possible to develop home ownership options, but it's not the easiest. It probably will be more renter options in these areas.
Yeah,
And then
it's- Hi there. Hey, Council. This is Victor Tran with Cascade Partners. Thank you for your time tonight. That's a very good question, and it's a really hard one to answer because a lot of development depends on the entitlements given. And for climate-friendly areas, the intent of the program is to create more walkable mixed-use districts. And from a market perspective, it lends itself to certain product types. So for downtown and Glenwood, when we did our market analysis, these areas tended to skew towards more of the like mid-range densities, 3-story apartment buildings, that type of thing. So most likely these products would be more on the rental side. However, it is really up to the market to build what they see fit with entitlements they're given. So a long-winded way of saying it's hard to know the answer to that question other than we can look at the entitlements that are given in CFAs and make a kind of a best guess based on what those provide. But it could potentially lead to more ownership housing or more rental housing, depending on what the market decides to produce.
Councilor Wadley?
Thank you. And I really appreciate Counselor.
Second. Did the attorney need to jump in there?
I have information if it's helpful in response to that based on when we were working during the rulemaking process with DLCD staff on the primary CFA's minimum density. They were unable to provide us any examples, even using the middle housing resources that they provided, where you could develop home ownership housing that was not reliant on a condo or land trust type model. So there were no options that they could show us where there was sort of the one house per lot, not stacked housing that would meet those minimum density requirements. So I would say from the information that we had in our comments during the rulemaking process, it's not clear at all that it would be possible to do home ownership housing outside of a condominium model in the primary CFAs.
Right, Councilor Rodley.
Did you want to jump in again?
I was just going to say which Oregon's condo rules and laws and regulations are so cumbersome that they disincentivize builders or developers to want to do condos. So it's really unlikely to see at least the way it is right now.
Now it's my turn.
Now it's your turn.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate that question because, and we've talked about this before, that there are those of us who would really just like to see condo reform, and maybe this would help put some pressure around that. And also like the balance. I think, one, I really appreciate all of the outreach around this, because one of the things that I don't know that I was thinking about really hard before that rose to the top of people's concerns is wanting to make sure that people don't get priced out of living in Springfield. And so when I was reading through this and thinking about this, I was like, oh, that really, we don't know exactly yet what we're going to do in Glenwood. And we want it to be as mixed as possible, right? To your point, like we want people to be able to purchase there. We want people to be able to have businesses and restaurants and people can afford to live there and walk and move around. So I don't know that I'm making any suggestions other than I just wanted to out loud say that us thinking about that affordability and how do we support people living in Springfield is just going to be an important piece of this. I'm fine with moving forward with it the way it is. I know that there are some folks in the Mohawk area that are a little concerned about the height and what that might look like, because that would be a big change in that area. And it'll probably take us a while to get there.
Councilor Crowe.
You knew, didn't you?
I almost started with you.
I'm just curious on the community engagement and the feedback that you received. Did you actually get anybody that was a landlord or a property management company or developers, the people that were talking about potentially putting these restrictions on how they do their business and how they rent? And
It's hard to know since the survey was anonymous. At in-person events, I think, we didn't ask that either, but we did mail to all property owners and residents in the area. I think the last round of outreach in the spring, we did more deliberate outreach to some major landowners. Like we talked with the Glenwood Master Plan team about how this would work with that. And then Peace Health, since they're a significant landowner in that one area. And they didn't have concerns that it would get in the way of what they were wanting to do. So that was at least helpful to hear. And I don't think we saw a lot of specific comments come through with that in the survey either.
okay, yeah, I just would have some concerns when I hear that the feedback was, yeah, we want to make sure that landlords, that there's rules around how we can be, evicted or whatever it is. It sounds like that probably came more from, are less likely to have come from the people that are actually out there renting the properties. The other thing is I too share the concern with Mohawk, and being a primary rather than a secondary. I'd almost rather see that, downtown area going to 14th than to make that a primary, just because of the height, building height and some of that stuff that surrounds that area. Isn't it also with these overlays, with the CFA overlay, doesn't that create more requirements like more green spaces and parks and things like that that are put on the responsibility of the property owners to make them?
It gets specific in prioritizing parks access in that area. A lot of that's on us. Thankfully, these areas were found to have decent enough parks access already.
Okay.
So like Mohawk, I think the main issue is improving transportation access to get to the parks
Yeah,
in that area.
definitely. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Councilor Tom.
Just one thing, if we're looking at adding the CFA to the downtown piece, some of that's zoned industrial. Does that stay industrial or does that what happens to that industrial land in terms of development?
We did remove all of the industrial area except for there's some Booth Kelly mixed use, which is the closest. But we did earlier on try to remove, it's probably hard to see in this map, but in the packet, it's a little easier with the tax lot boundaries. So the Booth Kelly mixed use is that like brown hatched area, which was more CFA compliant, but we deliberately excluded the industrial just because it's so different than what a CFA should be.
Right, and I would just kind of, even though the city owns currently the Booth Kelly land, I'd be very concerned about losing that key piece of industrial real estate for the industrial purposes. I understand that it's not currently used by an active rail user, but that is a key piece of, I think, Springfield's industrial backbone that we would be remiss to lose that section on, or to make it more difficult for an industrial user to take up space there. Again, I understand the building has problems, but that's all. Thank you.
All right. So what is the advantage to having Mohawk be a primary CFA?
Really just accommodating more housing capacity to account for that upcoming housing planning effort. I think we went back and forth of it mostly functions as a primary. So the heights in the mixed use commercial district, I think, are 90 feet. CFA, a primary CFA would require 85. It's very different than the reality of what's on the ground there right now. The main change would be the density. So I think that's the trade-off of if we require a higher minimum density, we get to count that towards our housing capacity requirement. If we have the lower density, it speaks to your comments earlier about just permitting more housing types.
So it's been a long time since we saw the market analysis, but if my memory serves, did Mohawk, because I thought it was like in two tiers. One of them was sort of a lower density, sort of housing products, and then the second one was some of those higher tower type housing products. And if my memory serves, they were saying that the market analysis was saying those higher end, high density, high towers were not going to develop in Mohawk.
Yes, that's correct. And I'll let Victor speak if there's more thoughts, but I think the land costs in Mohawk are pretty high. So that would be pretty infeasible for the actual tall development to happen.
Do you have anything you want to add, Victor?
That's essentially it. We found across all 4 proposed CFA locations that for example, like the 7-story mixed use types are incredibly hard to make work. For Mohawk specifically, we targeted the 3 to 4-story apartment range as being more feasible. But like Chelsea said, the one advantage of being assigned as a primary CFA is you allow that greater envelope of entitlements. And there's nothing in the code that says you have to build up to a certain height, but it's more of a you're allowed up to a certain height for a primary versus secondary CFA.
I guess the thing that I'm trying to wrap my head around, and maybe I'm not thinking about this right, is the market analysis says those heights won't develop. But if we market it, if we designated a primary CFA, then we're sort of counting those in a potential housing need, which in theory would, sort of lower our gap for other policy options. So in my mind, and please correct me if I'm thinking about this wrong, is that maybe we actually want to leave it as a secondary where the market analysis supports that level a little bit more, because then it will force us further down the road to choose some other policy options to sort of soak up the additional housing need in the community.
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. And with Mohawk as secondary, if we continue to have Glenwood Riverfront and the downtown boundary at 14th, we have plenty of housing capacity either way.
And so if everybody would, I'm looking to see if people are kind of head nodding about maybe keeping Mohawk as a secondary CFA. Okay. The other, I guess, question that I had about CFAs in general, well, when I read, we probably need to back up a whole other step. When we do the public hearing here, we're going to get a lot of questions about different housing types. And as housing continues to get more complicated, one of the things that would help us is to just get a clear set of definitions around what do we mean when we're talking about what goes in CFAs, what's low income, what's affordable housing, what's subsidized housing, because I think that's going to help lead the community through the conversation. Because if we get confused about affordability levels, right, and we see you guys every Monday, then 60,000 people are going to get a little bit more confused. I think that with that one change to Mohawk, I think I'm fine with the recommendations, for you guys to write them up. The only other question I have is really around Glenwood. If we cover that sort of, the not the master plan area, the refinement plan area, one of the constant pieces of feedback we get from developers is that, that the refinement plan makes it really difficult to develop smaller parcels in Glenwood. So if you take that sort of feedback and you overlay primary CFAs on top of that, are we getting so many regulations that we will never see anything happen in that sort of western end of Glenwood?
That's a good question. I think a big part of the code approach we ended up recommending, we could have kept the Glenwood office mixed use as it is and just make it CFA compliant, but really CFAs will make it easier or it's more permissive of a mix of uses. Right now, the office mixed use district is a little bit restrictive because it has that high requirement for office and there's not the market to support that. We would be getting rid of that barrier and to allow just it would all become residential mixed use and similar to like what the master plan is doing, not have it be so different of like, this is primarily residential, this is primarily commercial. It's kind of like we allow all these things. It's up to the market to decide what's allowed.
So, okay, so when we get done towards implementation, the thinking is on that western half of Glenwood, we're gonna see, it may
Make it
just become,
easier.
yep, okay,
Yeah, that's our hope.
perfect. Yeah, this looks good. So I appreciate you guys bringing it forward. Did anybody else have other comments? So I think we're ready to go. I think we're fine with the recommendation. Just switch Mohawk to a secondary.
Thank you so much. That's helpful.
Thank you. I guess we're going to CETA next, so we are adjourned.